Bloodthirsty by Martin Waddell. They shook hands with Henry, slit his throat, attached brown blood and breath bags to his wheezing lungs and dribbling arteries, snapped the bone, cut the remaining sinews and lifted his head clear of his body and straight into a preservation tank. "All right?" Miss Phipps asked, and the head managed a grim smile in reply. It didn't feel like talking for, not surprisingly, it had a sore throat. With the operation completed, they threw the rest of Henry away, and the head nodded sleepy approval. They put it on a special trolley and wheeled it away from the theatre, through the corridor that passed the Memorial Rose Garden and the Cat's Cemetery, to the special room reserved for the brain. The brain in Henry's head. It thought of itself with a capital B because it was, without a doubt, a first-class specimen. The brain in Henry's head was not sorry to be rid of the rest of him. It was used to having his arms and legs and other accessories around it, but just recently most of Henry had been getting on its nerves. The brain had not found it difficult to accept that Henry must go. As the brain saw it, Henry was strictly fifth-rate, and an outdated model at that. He had his uses. You could even say he'd been good for the brain, but now life in Henry's skull had degenerated to the point where it was just one illness after another. From toothache, with an element of mystery, for Henry had long lost his teeth, to sciatica, Burger's disease, to bronchitis. Poor Henry managed to contract a lot, and the brain could only sit tight and endure it. Henry was its third body in 80 years, and nothing like as suitable as William or Francis had been. The brain had quite lost sympathy with him. The brain was not unkind, though it did not allow sentiment to govern its actions. It sent Henry out for a splendid dinner the week before the operation, followed by an evening of sensual excess, which was almost too much for the poor old chap. But apart from that one gay outing, it allowed no let-up in its work schedule, which had a high priority stateside. Henry was for the chop, which was rough on Henry, but there was no reason for the brain to get upset about it. Take out the brain, it reasoned, and what have you? A turnip, a potato. And who feels for a turnip or potato when they're peeled and gutted? The brain, never less than fair, did try to explain this to the rest of Henry, but he couldn't get over his fear, which was to do with what knives felt like and other trivialities. The brain was a thinking thing. It couldn't cope with the instincts the original owner had planted deep in Henry. Henry's original owner had, unfortunately, but not without reason, suspected what they were going to do to him long before they did it. Henry definitely didn't like it. There was nothing he could do about it, but this did not stop him trying. Once, when the brain wasn't concentrating, the morning after the farewell celebration dinner, Henry had a quick try at damaging the brain, but this amounted to no more than dashing his head against a brick wall, which hurt his head much more than the brain. Poor Henry wasn't designed for thinking. He could only manage his instincts, and this proved far too great a handicap. The brain ran rings around him. The brain was of course very smart, so smart in fact, that there really were very sound reasons for perpetuating its existence at the expense of the Henrys, Williams and Francises of this world for the greater good of mankind. As it told its friends, a phrase with ominous overtones. The brain must go on was another slogan it appreciated, but of course poor Henry couldn't go on because the brain was hard on its bodies. When the brain was in its first incarnation, Francis hit on God Save the Brain, but hours later, when in William, who had religion before the brain got him, it realised the inherent difficulties in this thesis. If anybody was getting worshipped round the place, it had to be the brain, so it set up what was left of William as a memorial in the research centre. Francis and Henry were thrown away. The removal of the head was always a nasty stage. Neither William nor Francis had taken it well when their time came, and Henry was no exception to this rule. The brain, isolated in its preservation tank, found that Henry's head had somehow managed to contract earache, toothache, and a second cousin to neuritis in an arm with which it no longer had any connection. The brain was supposed to be responsible for pain, but it couldn't cut out the efforts of Henry's head, which was most determined. It must have been something bad in the blood. "How's your old head then?" Roger said, standing by the preservation tank which contained Henry's head, with the brain still secure inside it. The head blew bubbles through the hypernal fluid at him. "Sorry, old chap," Roger said, and put on his long rubber gloves. Then he carefully slid back the tank protector shield and manipulated Henry's head so that the lips were clear of the blood-streaked grey liquid. It tasted of peppermint, but how Roger found that out is another disgusting story. "This head's given me hell," the brain said, by way of Henry's mouth, which he'd bitten rather badly during the operation. Henry's thing about knives lasted right up to the end, for they'd only given him a local anaesthetic because of the anendrum secretion. Henry's face was swollen now and gave his severed head, otherwise not unpleasant to look at, a turnipoid look. "Are you sure you have those blood bags switched on properly? I feel as if I had something stuck in my gullet." "You have no gullet," Roger pointed out. "Don't get smart with me," the brain said. "Sorry, old chap," Roger said, quite cowed. He had a lot to thank the brain for, which was most annoying. Any more old guff out of you, he thought to himself, and I'll snip off those little brown bags which pulsate beneath your treble chins. But it was double chins, of course, for one of them had to go already. Snip the bags, and the brain would quickly choke on blood-streaked grey peppermint tasting liquid. One rasping gurgle and all would be over. "I don't mind telling you, Roger," the brain said, once more affable. "It's been much worse this time. You were a bit hap-handed with that scalpel, you know. Very messy. Old Henry had it hard, but he's getting his own back. I've got pains in his feet now, and God knows where they are." "I'm very sorry," Roger said. The brain was about to tell him more when Henry's head, instinctively squeamish about such things, managed to twitch and roll under the turgid red and grey liquid in the tank. Distastefully, Roger put his hand inside again, like burrowing through a vat of melted raspberry ice cream, he thought, and righted the head. The brain licked Henry's swollen lips and said crossly, "You see? He did that." "What do you want me to do about it?" Roger said. "I think you'd better cut me out of this head," the brain said. Which is how the brain came to be lodged, temporarily, in a plastic bag without a head to call its own. Henry's head they threw away, in more or less the same direction as his body, though they did not get together, not in this world anyway. It was the brain that mattered. It was the brain that they carefully slopped into its pink-tinged plastic bag. They demonstrate the technique with the whites of eggs. The brain, which slithered down to nestle in a pool of denajatoid frog spawn in the bottom of the bag, sightless, deaf to the world around it, but still thinking away for all it was worth. That was the one thing you could always be sure of with the brain. Whatever else happened to it, it just kept on thinking, usually about its own comforts. Who the other body belonged to, they didn't know. And to tell the truth, they didn't trouble over much to find out. There was time to fill out the compulsory loan form, of course, but not to check too carefully on his credentials. In his pockets they found a corkscrew, a small chess set, a black handkerchief, and a postcard from Transylvania, which didn't help at all. These things must be done quickly, and he was, after all, exactly what they were looking for. He was a fine young man, in perfect mechanical order, vaccinated against all the appropriate diseases and free of all the more obvious physical handicaps which might have ruled him out as a carrier for the brain. True, his teeth were a little odd, 2 of them at least were much too sharp and long, but at the time no one paid any attention to that. He had bright red hair and blue eyes and a hole in his head you could put a bullet through, which is exactly what someone had done. Not that the hole worried them. In light of what they were about to do with him, it was, if anything, an added advantage. "Quite a mess," Roger said, surveying the pale newcomer, "but I suppose we can use him." It was Miss Phipps who waxed enthusiastic. Miss Phipps being Miss Phipps, she had every reason to. Though the brain was very practical, it was not above the lusts of William, Francis, though Francis was a bit peculiar, or Henry, and accordingly had allowed itself a relationship somewhat less than strictly professional with chubby, full-blooded Miss Phipps. This was very nice for the brain, and also very nice for Miss Phipps. She could, after all, put it down to patriotism. but by the time Henry's race was run it had become something of a drag. The newcomer, though a bit pale, looked full of potential. "Lovely," she said, patting her magnificent auburn tresses. "Of course he might recover," Roger said. "Nonsense," Miss Phipps said decisively. For that was something Roger should really have kept his mouth shut about. The new young man was going to lose his brain long before he got better if Miss Phipps had any say in the matter. "The bullet in his head will not allow a full recovery," she said. "We are obviously justified in what we're doing, and anyway I've signed the form now." "I wonder why he got shot at," Roger said. "That is not our concern," Miss Phipps said. "We've got to think of the brain. Think how much nicer it will be for it, going around in a nice young body like this." "I'm sure this one would be proud if he knew," Roger said. "Grateful," responded Miss Phipps wholeheartedly. They looked down fondly on the form before them, still breathing strongly despite Miss Phipps' prediction. "There's a lot of blood," Roger said, as he traced in the slit-in line around the lean white throat. "Waste not, want not," said Miss Phipps, and went off to fetch a container for it. For once, although she did not know it, the joke was on Miss Phipps. "We've got one for you, dear," Miss Phipps said, but of course the brain couldn't hear. It was busy in its pink-tinged plastic bag on a pretty piece of theoretical mutation, sure to prove a breakthrough. Miss Phipps didn't know about this. All she could see was the brain pulsing gently in its pool of denajatoid frog spawn, and quite frankly, she must have seen it through love's eyes, for it was quite revolting. "It's your sugar puss, Belinda," she said, cooing against the plastic. "Old brainy, come to mummy." Having said it, she realised that a change in approach would be called for. "Come to mummy" might have done for the brain in senile Henry, but the new body called for much more effort and originality. After blowing a kiss to the plastic bag, she left the brain's room and went down to the cat's cemetery to worry about it. The brain wasn't worried at all. It had settled in quite happily in its plastic bag, free of all distractions of the flesh, and Belinda Phipps was a considerable distraction, though the brain blamed her in part at least on old Henry, who had been starved for affection when occupied by his original owner. The brain he was born with, that is. Yes, the brain was content, quite certain that its operation would be a success. It had worked twice, so why not again? The Henrys of this world might come and go, but the brain would go on forever. If the brain pondered at all on where the Henrys and Williams and Francises came from, it did not show it, though strictly speaking it couldn't just then, save by slopping from side to side in the denajatoid frog spawn more energetically, for it had no body to show anything with. But it probably didn't ponder on it at all, for it was a happy, happy brain. It had a nice new body to come, with which it anticipated doing a lot of new things, and one or two old things better. They wheeled the new body down through the Memorial Rose Garden, turned left past the Cat Cemetery, and went through the swing doors leading to the operating theatre, where Miss Phipps and Roger took charge, affable smiles on their plump faces. Actually, the new body was smiling too, smiling so that his two peculiar teeth, the long sharp fang-like ones, gleamed over the pale pink of his lower lip, one set at each side of his mouth. If Belinda Phipps and Roger had harboured a little of the romantic in their souls, they might have taken a note of this little oddity, and possibly taken it as a warning. But they were not, unfortunately, romantics, though they were superb technicians. It was as technicians that they had set about enlarging the hole in the new body's head, then squeezed out the damaged brain, or what was left of it, and threw it away. One hopes that, in some sweeter place, it may have encountered the brainless Henry, and come to some arrangement. The brain, in its plastic bag, per force, incommunicado, somehow sensed that its time was near. It did its best to keep its wits about it, remembering that it was the brain, and much more important and respected than any other brain it knew. It was all eagerness to get into its new head, now that the old one had been satisfactorily disposed of. With love and care, Belinda Phipps plopped the brain, soft and slippery, with perhaps a little more ooze about than was desirable, out of its bag and into the newcomer's cavity, where it nestled in comfort, as they fitted the little metal plate securely into the bone of its new skull. If the mouth, with the two extra sharp teeth jutting out of it, smiled at that moment, it was not the brain's doing, but it may have been an instinctive reaction to the trickle of blood from the work overhead, which ran down the new body's waxen cheek and dripped upon its pale lips. "How do you feel today?" Roger asked the brain in its new body. Outside, the rain lashed down on the streets and people dashed around buying gumboots, with the sole exception of Belinda Phipps, who had been to Richard Henry's to get her hair done and was now selecting a nice new frilly nightgown at the bridal bar in Harrods. "Fine," said the new body, sitting up. "By the way, you should call me Alexis now. Count Alexis." "Splendid," said Roger. "You're not too cramped in there, or anything?" "No, this one will do splendidly," said Count Alexis. "Anything I can get for you?" Roger asked. "No, thank you," said Count Alexis, planting his feet on the floor beside the bed. "You really shouldn't be getting up yet," said Roger. "You look a little pale, Count." "Nonsense," said Count Alexis, reaching for his black tights. 10 minutes later he was on his way round the unit, introducing himself to old friends, not all of whom were glad to see him, yet his walk seemed to take a lot out of him. As time went by he grew paler, his long black gloved hands began to quiver, his two sharp teeth to grate against the faint stubble on his chin. It was quite half an hour before he managed to tear himself away from the brain's affairs and secrete himself in the blood depository. "Like milk," said the orderly. "He was standing there slugging it, like milk out of a bottle." "Don't be so ridiculous," said her friend. "Dribbling down his chin," she said. "Then he looked at me, such a look." "Maybe he was thirsty," said her friend scornfully. "You don't want to go around spreading tales like that. You know who he is, don't you?" "He said I could call him Alexis. Then he tried to... "He's the brain," said her friend. "There now. So it must be all right, mustn't it?" Belinda Phipps, as befits a top technician, had a splendid home near Sunningdale, surrounded by tall fir trees which obscured the angry moon. It was a hot, airless night, and she lay on her large four-poster bed. Miss Phipps collected antiques. In her splendid new bridal bar nightie, lustrous hair curling on her shoulders, and the white monogrammed pillow, dark eyes a-glitter in the candlelight, she found candlelight romantic. She was restless and full of petty frustration. "You can call me Alexis," he had said, showing her his new black velvet cloak. But where was he? Apparently with the brain's new body. Punctuality was not important. Transylvanian Count or no Transylvanian Count, she'd soon knock that out of him. Belinda Phipps was nothing if she was not businesslike. And an arrangement was an arrangement, a form of contract, even if it was for a night of passion. Somewhere in the tall trees outside an owl hooted. Or was it an owl? It could have been the call of a lost soul, but Belinda Phipps didn't take it that way. She was far too rational. The skeletal arm of a tree rapped to pain. A distant dog howled, but she lay on undisturbed, a superb technician to the end. It was the technician in her that had her counting the seconds between the thunderclaps and charting them at the little desk in the corner of her room, when the window unaccountably burst open. She turned, auburn tresses flowing on her white shoulders, bosom all a-heave, locket trapped in her cleavage, to find a black figure outlined against the drapes, fierce eyes upon her. He strode forward, seized Miss Phipps and bore her to the bed. "Alexis!" she cried. "Count Alexis! Brain! What are you? Ah!" His fangs cut her throat, ripped the soft white skin, milked the pumping blood from her veins. So much better than the bottled variety. When he rose from her, the pillow on which she lay was awash with blood, her bridal bar nightie in tatters. Miss Belinda Phipps lay ravished in the moonlight as the fiend, sated, drew his black cloak around him and fled amid the gaunt trees. He exited splendidly, though there was no one to see him. The hearse he had had to hire from a company which specialised in such things, but he drove it with the verve of an expert. Long cloak flapping about him as the 4 black horses drew him away down the drive. An hour later he was home in Hangman's Hall, Clapham. clambering into the great big black coffin in the cellar. The brain was very, very happy. In the past, Francis's peculiarity had been awkward. Henry's senile decay a bit of a bore. But Count Alexis's technique was a revelation. As usual, the brain had done superlatively well. Much better than the original owner, who'd had to make do without most of the trimmings because of his social position. Something which did not inhibit the brain one bit. Count Alexis's satisfied senses told him he had done well. But then the brain was always best at anything he put his mind to. Count Alexis lay back in his coffin, drew his cloak around him, settled himself in comfort against the silk accessories, and pulled down the lid. A pleasing prospect of bloody days before him. He was destined, after all, to be the smartest vampire in Christendom.